Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I am Blake Fisher, and I am a political junkie so that you don't necessarily have to be. Thank you for spending some of your valuable time with me today. All right, we are finally past the election, and one thing I was left desperately wanting after an absolutely vapid and substanceless campaign was more discussions of policies and solutions to problems that we're facing as a country. So for this episode, I spoke with Ken W. Good. He's an attorney down in Texas and host of the Bail Post podcast about bail reforms recently enacted or in some cases rolled back in states like New York, Illinois, and California. If government has a primary objective, in my opinion, it's public safety. And supporters of ending cash bail in Illinois claim it will improve public safety. But do they have any data to back that up? Are recidivism rates lower in places that have eliminated private and cash bail? We're going to talk about that. So we recorded this conversation before the election. And so we were speculating about some things like California's Prop 49, as well as how we thought crime would affect the election outcomes across the country. I believe that crime is mostly affected at the local level, so it's important to look at what other cities and states are doing and pay attention to what works and what doesn't. This is a conversation largely about what we think doesn't work, and when it comes to the progressive sort of criminal justice reforms that we've seen enacted around the country. So here is my conversation with Ken.
Ken, thank you for coming on. Tell us about who you are, what you do, and how you got involved in this topic specifically.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. My name's Ken Good. I am an attorney from Tyler, Texas. So Texas born and raised. I have been an attorney for over 35 years now. I actually started out practicing law, representing doctors and hospitals when they got sued. But a bondsman, had a whole bunch of default judgments, and they said, "Who do you hire to fix those?" And they told him that he needed to hire a special kind of attorney, and that was the kind of attorney I was. And so I undid all those for him, and then suddenly word of mouth spread, and I started doing this area of the law. So I became an expert in bail law in Texas, and then we started having these federal cases get filed, and nobody was really stating the issues the way I thought they should be stated. And so I set about to become knowledgeable about those issues. There was a case in Harris County that was pending where I went and sat in on a hearing, and I was shocked the way the judge was ruling, and I thought she was wrong. And so I started writing articles on all of these issues, and that judge ended up being overturned like 7 or 8 times now in her cases. And ultimately they said that case that I would say screwed up so badly should have never even been filed in federal court. So I think time has proven me correct on that. I kind of have an appellate mind. I like to look at legal issues. And so I just started writing more and more articles on those issues, and then started talking about what other states are doing. And then we started our own little podcast on focusing on criminal justice issues called the Bail Post. You can find it at thebailpost.com. And that's kind of what's happened. I just had an article published either yesterday or today in the Attorney at Law magazine dealing with rising crime. Is it really happening, or is it just a Republican talking point?
Yeah, that seems to be the kind of it's a talking point. Whether that's all it is or not, we don't really know, I guess. You're right, because there's some conflicting information there. So, because I guess between the FBI's data and the NCVS stuff from the Justice Department, is kind of telling two different stories,
also
right?
The CDC tracks homicides, and their data shows homicides are up, not flat, not down, and they're up like 20%. And so I would say there's not conflicting data. There's incomplete data from the FBI because they changed the way that they're accumulating data. They changed that 4 or 5 years ago, and they've had terrible compliance, and it's costly to get into their new system. And so I don't think that there's a dispute. I mean, when the NAACP in Oakland, California, demands a state of emergency on crime from their local elected officials, and then the regional NAACP agrees with them, I think we got a crime problem. Well, and I think there's a reason why
certainly in Oakland,
is saying, there's a reason why they're not admitting it, because if they did, the voters would punish them for it. So they have to deny that crime is increasing.
Yeah, and when it comes to crime, obviously, my default position is that, of course, this is sort of my default position with a lot of stuff with politics, but my default position is your locality matters a lot more than anything that's happening at the federal level. Like for the most part, not that I'm saying the president doesn't have some control of this kind of stuff, but if you live in Oakland, you're much more, your local DA and your police, and like those are the people that are going to drastically affect one way or another quickly.
I agree with you. I agree with you, but the backlash always happens at the federal level. I mean, we're really committing the same cycle that we did in the 60s. In the 60s, we felt more safe, so we were more forgiving on our criminal laws. What do you know? Quinky-dink of all quinky-dinks, crime started to increase.
Right.
And so we started to have a discussion about how to address the increase in crime. One side of the political spectrum refused to even participate in what to do, and it resulted in a backlash, and it resulted in one of the reasons why Reagan was elected. He had the war on crime, the war on drugs.
Yeah.
And so I think we're going through that same cycle again. The pendulum has swung much farther to the left because we have these activist groups that are much more better organized, but that just means that when we ultimately have the swing to the right, it's going to be much harder than it was in the 60s.
Yeah. And I think that's probably, I think that's a big problem with today's politics is that we're swinging so far one way or the other instead of kind of carefully calibrating and even looking back to see what worked and what didn't.
That's because we've gotten rid of the middle. We don't have the safeguards in Congress anymore on most issues that force people to the middle. We've gotten rid of the filibuster on most issues. And then as a result of that, the people that are funding elections are from the fringes on both sides. So we're getting rid of the middle. So that's the reason why when we have a new party, a new president elected from the opposing party, his first year now is spent trying to undo as much as he can undo from the previous party. Until two elections ago, we've never had that happen before. And now it's like business as usual.
Yeah, it's just like, and I think that's one of the craziest things about today's political environment is that I don't understand how anyone, I'm doing podcasting, so it's not that hard. But, if you own a business or you're a lawyer or, pick any number of other industries, the head spinning change that happens every 4 years potentially just seems like it would be impossible to keep up with. That like something you were doing yesterday is now potentially illegal because someone signed an executive order. It seems like it's unattainable,
where
right?
I think it's awful and doing very, very much damage to our country is you go into one county and they no longer prosecute something as a crime. You go to the next county and they prosecute that as a crime still. And that has a profound effect. It undermines our criminal justice system. And that's happening really everywhere. When you have these urban elected DAs who are getting financial support, but from, a Soros type organization, well, they're elected, then they're invited to a seminar. It's a quid pro quo. We got you elected. This is what we expect from you. And it's terrible. It's terrible policies. Some of the policies even violate state law. And then they have other groups that do research and hand them research and say, this is what you will rely upon for these policies. And they have other groups that are PR firms that will give them the press releases that they're expected to release to support these policies. And that's what gets us, we're no longer prosecuting theft under $950.
Right.
And that's what got them in California, $25,000 a day in shoplifting. That's what got them stores closing because they can't withstand that. That's what got them property values dropping on commercial properties where they're selling for 30% to 50%. And even there's an example out of Minnesota where they in an inner city that had the same issues where they're sold for less than 10% of the value it had the last time it sold. So these policies are having a real detrimental impact on our criminal justice system. And they're also trying to support bad bail policy, saying, no, we don't need to have the private industry bail. Everybody wants to come back to court. And here's all these things that prove that. And, all the data that we're now getting from COVID has proven that, if you don't make them come to court, they don't come to court. When there's an 80% failure to appear rate in Houston and in California misdemeanor courts, because they use these simple release mechanisms, that means you've got a criminal justice system collapsing.
Yeah, so let's talk about that because that's the real reason we wanted to have you on was talk about kind of the bail reform stuff that happened specifically in Illinois and obviously There's been some municipalities that have sort of enacted sort of things like this. Not really. It's really just DAs just choosing not to prosecute, basically, in some of these places, which there's been some backlash to that in some of the cities where that's happened. There's been the sort of upper middle class people have just kind of said, like, we're either out of here or we're recalling these people. So it's happening in some of the crazier examples of, like, Oregon saying all drugs are legal and pretty quickly within a year or two realizing, this didn't help solve the problem at all, which, I mean, I think most of us could have said, yeah, we thought that's exactly what would have happened. But I'm also super into federalism and letting, one state try something, and if it works well, other states can adopt it. I'm also all for states trying something that they only want to do because that's just what they want to do. I mean, that's okay. So Illinois does this. Illinois passes, basically they get rid of cash bail, right? So there's no more, it's just, there are a list of, I guess explain it a little bit of how it's actually working now. This went into effect last September, right?
Well, okay, so Illinois, I mean, when you hear the term Illinois got rid of cash bail, that does not mean they got rid of the private industry, because they had already done that. They did that 20 years ago, or around 20 years ago. And so when crime started increasing, that's when they got rid of the private surety bail. What they had left were cash bonds, which some people think are synonymous with the private industry, but it's not. You put up cash or a percentage of the bond amount in cash with the court, and if you come to court, then you get your cash back. But if you don't, then the courts keep it. And so the courts in Illinois were relying upon people's failures to appear to fund a portion of court operations. So when they said in Illinois they got rid of cash bail, they got rid of cash bonds, and they didn't replace the funding for the courts as a result of their actions. And so crime was already increasing from what they did 20 years ago. And so now it's just a lot worse, and the courts don't have the money for operations. So as you can imagine, crime is running amok in Illinois, especially in Chicago. But what you see is these groups, these activist groups that are funded by Soros, they'll come out with some type of research saying, crime has not increased as a result of cash bail.
Right.
And so it's like they're doing acrobatics to defend what they've done. Because again, if you and I would say, okay, it's not working, so we need to change to something else. They can't do that, because if they admit that what they've done has increased crime, the public will turn on them. That's why you see in New York, they enacted bail reform several years ago. They've already rolled it back 3 times.
Yeah.
And we're fixing to have another backlash in the election, I think, in November. Because, really, if you think about it, the House of Representatives is only in control of the Republicans because of New York. And that was 2 years ago as a result of a backlash on crime.
Yeah, and New York actually, so as I was looking into the data for this, Chicago, obviously we're only a year into the full-on, like, getting rid of cash bond kind of stuff. So we don't have a lot of data because it's 1 year in, and you're right, they're saying it's flat, and you look at some of the data and it's flat, but like correlation's not causation. It doesn't
crime is already
it was already really high
in Chicago and Illinois. And so they're not even trying to address crime. They're just saying it's not increased even more because of what they're doing. And you and I know, just as just common sense, if you just ever let everybody go, I mean, then that's a green light to commit more crime. They're not going to come back to court. And, we already had a problem in Chicago and Illinois where we were having to discount crime to get people to come and complete their cases. So we're giving sweetheart deals on violent offenses where they get very little jail time because their criminal justice system was already collapsing, and it's just it's gotten worse, and now they're just trying to defend it.
Yeah, and to me, there's kind of 2 different problems here, and it's impossible to separate them because they go hand in hand with each other. To me, the 2 problems are, one, if someone's arrested for a crime, we've got to decide, does this person need to stay in jail while they await trial because they're either a danger to others or they're a flight risk? I mean, that's essentially the 2 categories that people would fall into, right? And then the second problem is, are we going to prosecute that crime appropriately? So there's kind of 2 problems here, in my opinion, because the first thing is, like I said, we've got to go, is this person a danger to someone else? So if they're violent towards a spouse, for example, do we release them? And there's obviously a danger they're going to hurt or potentially escalate that violence. I mean, especially when it comes with domestic stuff. to me, that seems the most obvious pattern of escalation that we have.
Here's the problem with that. We need to, in states like Illinois, they're trying to develop a release or detain system, and they're doing it on a charge basis.
Right.
And so they're not making a decision on their criminal history. They're just saying, what are you charged with? And that's where we're getting in trouble on misdemeanors, because they're saying no matter how many times you commit catalytic converter theft, you can never be held. Well, our organized crime, our gangs, our career criminals see that, and they figure out ways to make millions of dollars off of that.
Yeah.
And so what we need to be doing is setting up a strong set of accountability. So when I come before you as the judge, you look at me and you go, okay, you're charged with theft, Mr. Good, but you've got a 10-year criminal history on theft. And so I'm not just going to release you. I'm going to require you to have a bond. And if you fail to show up for court, you are going to jail, and you're going to stay there till your case is resolved. We don't have that. I mean, look in Houston, Texas, someone for theft they're just going to get simply released. Mm-hmm. And if they fail to show up 10 times, they're just going to get simply released 10 more times.
Right.
No accountability, no matter what their criminal justice, no matter what their criminal history is. I mean, Texas strengthened their bail reform law by requiring judges to review criminal history. And I think that I applaud them. But we have judges like in Houston where politics is trumping everything, where they just won't apply their discretion. I mean, I had a judge tell a police officer when he went to visit his courtroom, he's like, my party wants me to release people, and so I'm following what my party wants. I mean, I can never imagine that being said 5 years ago.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, this gets into a whole other category of I question whether we should be electing judges and DAs when that kind of political pressure gets put on them, because it seems like that's inevitable where you're going to end up one way or the other, right? Is that someone's going to feel a pressure from their party or their constituents. It is one of those tricky things, because I also want to be able to hold those people accountable if we need to. It seems like the incentives are all messed up here, because the incentive should be, in my opinion, for a judge or for the entire criminal justice system. The point of it all is to, like, it's a public safety thing. When it really boils down to, like, if we're just saying it's one thing, it's public safety. It's, does this person pose a threat? Did they cause a crime? Did they create a crime? Did they commit a crime that is, we say, should be punished? And do they have any sort of, while we're waiting that they're innocent until proven guilty, but do we have enough evidence right now to say they're a threat to the public or they're a flight risk? And right now, I guess it seems like Illinois wants to take that completely out of the subjective view of a judge and wants it to be a list of things that are like, here's a crime you can hold someone for, which it's still subjective at that point. Is that correct? Where it's like if someone, commits a violent crime, it's still up to the judge at that point in Illinois? Or is it like mandatory pretrial?
Okay, so in the states that are doing these types of reforms, they're tying the hands of the judges. That's why they're listing charges that the judge no longer has any discretion. They have to release them, no matter what their criminal history is, no matter what their how many times they've committed that crime. But they're also doing it. They're taking the discretion away from the judges on the decision on whether to hold them. They're making it a mini trial.
Yeah.
So it's the DA's office. Do you want to make a motion to detain, and then do you want to put on evidence, usually within 72 hours of arrest? Do you want to disclose your evidence? And so it's no longer like in Texas, it's an abuse of discretion standard. It's on the judge. He's the one responsible for public safety and determining whether somebody should stay in jail. Innocence or guilt has nothing to do with pretrial detention.
Right.
It's just, what assurance are you going to give the court that you're going to return to answer your charges? And then a public safety issue. There's a list of factors that the courts have to determine. But in Illinois, they've kind of taken it all away from the courts. The courts, on the low-level offenses, they have no discretion. They have to release no matter how many times, no matter what their criminal history is. And on the severe ones, they've put it on the DA's office. And so it's a clear and convincing evidence standard. And you have to have a mini trial, like within 72 hours after arrest. And a lot of times the DAs don't want to put that evidence on that quickly. And
right.
So you've got a lot of people being released for that reason.
So New York, we have a lot more data because, like you're right, they've done a lot more stuff, and it almost all. I'll pull it up. I'll put all this stuff in the show notes and send me anything that you want as far as articles that'll be in the show notes. But they had every kind of charge, aggravated assault, battery, all these sort of things, and then they showed basically recidivism rates of rearrest after people were arrested for a crime and then released pre-trial, essentially. And all of them, all but like 3 of them were higher than they were on just the original arrest rate. So it seems like it's pretty obvious, at least in New York. Now, Illinois, we don't have that same kind of data. Like I said, it's only been 1 year, so it's a little harder to track. They're saying it's flat. I would argue that if it's flat, and some people are saying it's going up, and some people are saying it's going down, Illinois is also a weird place because. And New York's a little bit like this too, in the sense that in New York, most of it was in Manhattan, right? It wasn't a state. It wasn't a state law, right? With New York, it was New York City that was doing some of this stuff. Is that correct?
No, it's the legislature in New York that passed the statute, and then they've rolled it back 3 times, and they do it as a result of the budget.
Right.
So no one has. It's not ever debated. It's just what can one party put up with it on the rollback.
So it does seem like these rates of people getting arrested and being arrested again before their trial even happens after being released, it happens a lot. And from all the stats we see on crime, that's always the case almost. Almost no one is just I got arrested one time for one crime and then I went to jail. It's almost always the violent criminals have been arrested before.
The recidivism rates is one of the areas where there's a huge debate and a huge argument. And I actually did a podcast with a former assistant DA from New York, talking about recidivism rates, comparing what law enforcement says the recidivism rates are versus what the supporters of the bail reform statute were saying. And he did a really good job of explaining why they're cooking the books. And excuse me.
No problem.
And they were doing the same thing in Harris County because they're using a very similar computation or mathematical formula to calculate recidivism rates. I mean, there's international groups that calculate recidivism rates between countries.
Yeah.
And that group says the recidivism rate in the United States is 45%. But you look at these groups that calculate recidivism rates, they're talking about 2 and 3%, or it's down. It's just... No. I mean, they're not using recognized calculations for recidivism rate.
Yeah, all the New York ones I was looking at were in like the 20s and 30%. They were not anywhere close to single digit numbers where it'd be like, well, we could look at. They were all high numbers. It was, and there's even some flow charts. I'll put, like I said, links in the show notes to those charts.
Law enforcement is the ones that have been calculating recidivism for decades. They know what to look at, and so these other groups, when they're saying, "Oh, recidivism isn't a problem," they're cooking the books. Law enforcement has calculated recidivism for many years, and they just question their credibility. Oh no, and what you don't hear is the reason why these groups are pushing for all these reforms is because they want this money, because the money going to law enforcement is the largest part of the county budget. So this defund the police, or this, we're going to take that money because we're going to save it from all the people that would have been put in jail. We're going to invest that in these social programs, which is where they want the money to be spent to begin with.
Right.
They weren't going to get their budgets increased, but if they can save it, well, then they can move it over. And that's really what's pushing a lot of these quote unquote reforms.
Well, in New York, they're trying to close the jail too, and then not replace it with the same number of beds, which just seems like, okay, you can, like, I have high aspirations to reduce crime to where you don't need those cells. But until you've done that, to me, it's foolish to do that, because now you're not going to have enough jail beds to. So
That's right.
The inevitable conclusion to that
correct.
is that we have to pick and choose which ones we prosecute because we don't have enough place to put these people. So it's kind of putting the cart before the horse. It'd be great. I mean, obviously, it would be great if we could solve where
they're actually doing something that has been done before. So California had their bed space for their prison system capped by a 3-judge panel. It was appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. It was a 5-4 decision affirming, if it was to go up again right now, that the 5-4 has changed, it would be reversed. But the minority, who's the majority now, they were saying in their dissent, how can we sanction or authorize the release of essentially, some division or some classification of an army group of criminals that are being released into society? And how can you expect anything but crime to increase? But so that's what we're seeing. They're wanting to do a backdoor reduction of capacity that will then force
Right.
the counties or the whatever you want to call them, the DAs, to not prosecute crime. Everything going on in California is to reduce their their prison population, because it's been capped. I mean, when you hear we're going to release more people from prison, but that's going to make us safer, that's bullcrap.
Right.
Because they're limited on their capacity. Everything is to reduce the prison capacity, and they know it's going to increase crime. They just can't say it. If they were to close Rikers Island in New York, it's the same damn thing.
And that's what doesn't make, like I said, if it's a noble goal. I'd be all for reducing prison population if it meant that we had fewer people committing crimes and therefore going to jail. But that's the order to me it should happen in, is not.
But here's the problem that nobody's talking about. The very groups they say that they're trying to help, we have systemic racism and we have to address that and fix that. Which group is going to be most hurt with these reforms? It's those same minorities. I mean, 50% of all murder victims in the United States are young black males. And who's doing those murders? By and large, young black males. Somewhere in this debate, we have turned it on its head, and we're favoring the murderers over the victims. And if we release those people back into society, they're going to go back into those neighborhoods first and commit more crime. When crime goes up, it goes up much faster in our minority communities. So if you think crime is up 10%, it's up a lot more than that in our minority communities. And so that's what's going on. And that's what no one's talking about, because again, they can't admit that it's happening, because if they do, they would be held accountable by the voters.
What's weird about that to me is that they're not being held accountable by the voter, because that's what's weird to me. Because in Chicago, it's the same thing. There was recently a thing because the mayor got rid of the shot spotter thing, that will triangulate gunshots and send law enforcement and paramedics essentially to those areas before anyone can even call 911. It can triangulate an exact location where those shots were fired. And the mayor decided this was racist, even though it's just microphones and math that's triangulating the sound of a gunshot. It doesn't know who pulled the trigger or anything. And it's it's an expensive program for sure, but it is saving lives, because people are paramedics are getting to gunshot victims faster because they're not having to wait for a 911 call or multiple 911 calls or specific, they're getting exact locations. And the people that were fighting it and fighting the mayor on it were those people in those communities that have the shot spotter program, because they're we're the ones that actually see, we're the ones that know the victims of these gunshot crimes. And so we want to see that. It was all what do they call them in Chicago? It's not city council. It's aldermen, or what do they call their city councilmen? It was all the people from those poor black neighborhoods in Chicago that were going, no, we like this technology. It's saving lives. We don't want more crime in our area. But it doesn't seem that
here's the
people
problem,
are voting
though.
that way, though.
But the activists are going to the areas, to the counties where they have where it's really a political party running that county. So they're going to areas where they have huge support, and they're pushing their agenda. And then when the people reject it, who do they have to call? Look in New York. I mean, Mayor Adams was considered law enforcement, and he stood up to him. And so he's been indicted now. Yeah. And he would say, right or wrong, he would say it's because he stood up to the federal government on immigration reform and said that this isn't right. I don't know if that's true. They're making, but he would say, look, I stood up to him and they did this, and no other mayor has stood up to him since then.
Yeah, the reason I don't buy that is because the timeline of the investigation of a foreign country doing, that takes a while anyway, and they would have had to be investigating this before his, immigration stuff that happened in the last year, in my opinion.
There's nothing that I wouldn't put. Politics has just gone so far into all this stuff. If politics can determine bail reform, can determine criminal justice reform, and to the extent that it's causing crime to increase, I'm at the point where anything's possible.
Yeah.
And we have to take politics out of those things. And if somebody's doing something wrong otherwise, well, then they shouldn't be doing that. But isn't that just tell us how bad politics is right now?
Yeah. So when it comes to the cash bail kind of stuff specifically, I think everyone's coming from it with good intentions, but that doesn't mean anything because intentions, like the trade-offs and like the actual policy and what their actual consequences matter, right?
I completely disagree. Nobody's coming from good intentions on the other side. And the reason why is, I can quote to you, there was a mayor that was on a News Nation town hall, and she's a former judge. And this is what she said: until you have an alternative to the private industry bail system that has the same high accountability and the same low level failure to appear. So low failure to appear rate, high accountability, then you don't have an alternative. You're just doing stuff that's going to make crime worse. So if you compare failure to appear rates, and that's important for criminal cases, because if you don't show up for court, very few situations that you can go forward. So most cases are put on hold until you come back, whether it's an hour, whether it's a day, whether it's weeks, months, or years, or you never come back. Your case is put on hold. And so the private industry has a failure to appear rate of less than 10%. Cash bonds is double that. Personal bonds or simple release mechanisms have a 50% failure to appear rate. In Harris County and in California, misdemeanor courts where they use it exclusively, it's an 80% failure to appear rate. Courts can't go forward with an 80% failure to appear rate. I mean, cases will end up being dismissed because an 80% failure to appear rate, because cases are being added to the criminal justice system conveyor belt at the same amount they were last year. But if you've got an 80% failure to appear rate, your backlogs are just growing at an immense rate. So you're just missing cases. So we got a de facto decriminalization, which is giving a green light for criminals to commit more crime. That's one of the reasons why crime is increasing.
So what do you think the intention is then of the people that want to?
Okay, so I think there's a political agenda, and I think we've talked about part of it is to move the funds, or a large part of the funds that are going to criminal justice, to social programs, and so to divert that. So to do that, we have to decriminalize a lot of crime, and we have to do it to the extent that the public will allow it. So right now we're in the phase where they're denying that crime is increasing. It's not because of what we're doing, so stick with us, and that's going to maybe hold a little bit longer, but not much, because the public will demand public safety. So I think we have it's a coalition. Some people want to decriminalize certain crimes. I think there's a few people in that group that want chaos, but I do think there are some people in that group that are well-intentioned. I do think there's some people in that group that think, we don't need bail because people are good. They want to come to court. They want to get their cases resolved.
Yeah, I think that's naive, obviously. That's naive.
I mean, there's a study from Yolo County that just during COVID compared people released on simple release versus, just their promise. Oh yeah, I'll come back to court. I promise. Versus somebody released on the private surety bail system. And he found that someone just simply released had a 180% greater chance of committing a violent offense in the next 18 months over somebody released on a on a surety bond. I mean, if you look at those numbers, and the legislature in California did, and they didn't pass any more bail reform as a result. But if you are an honest broker of the facts, you would look at that and go, why are we releasing anybody on a simple release? We got to change this because we're putting them in worse positions just by what we're doing. Nobody from the other side is admitting that. They don't care what the data shows. They have all these groups all lined up to paint the picture that what they want. I mean, look at Prop 49. That was our Prop 47 in California, passed years ago. That's the proposition that took away theft under $950. It started out by changing from felony to misdemeanors, and then the DAs in our urban areas said we're not going to prosecute anymore. I mean, there's a proposition on the ballot in November to, not repeal Prop 47, but roll it back substantially because of what's been going on. And the money that's been rolling in to oppose it from our friends on the far left are just amazing because they don't want it to be repealed, period. They don't care what the data shows. They just deny that that's what the data. They don't care what they've done to the very minority groups they say they were trying to help. They don't want it to change.
So in these kind of situations where, like, I'm all for looking at what works, looking at the data. I anecdotal stories don't so much interest me because you're going to always be able to find some story of, this happened and then they released and blah, blah, blah. But to me, when you look at the numbers as a whole, like I said, in New York specifically, because we've got more data on it, it's pretty clear that yes, it's like these numbers are going up when we say we're going to release everyone, and like I said, getting arrested while they're in pretrial, being released and stuff. So we're seeing those numbers go up. Is there, like, on the other side of the coin, because this has often come from on the people on the left that want to like advocate for this, or saying that cash bail is, disproportionately, it's harming low income people, it's harming minorities and stuff. On the other side of the spectrum, there are people that say part of the problem is that if you're rich, you're going to get out no matter what with a cash bail system. Is there some sort of happy medium that you like that says, here are certain crimes that we say, no matter what, you're doing pretrial detention, we don't care, like there's no amount of money that you're going to post a bail on? Or do you think it's still something that should just be judges based on criminal history, evidence that a DA brings? Like, do you think it should be totally on judges, or are there some statutory things that we could say, hey, these are things that you don't get out on pretrial, these are things that you can on a judge's discretion?
Okay, well, I mean that's a lot of things thrown at me, but
Yeah,
I would say I would make 3 points. But the first point I would make is the whole concept of bail is that it's individual.
Yeah.
So this idea that we've come up with, where we're making it charge-based release, where we're tying the hands of the judges, we're taking it away from the judges, we're making it an evidentiary issue. I mean, the judges know what they're doing. The reason why it was taken away from them is because the groups that are pushing for these reforms don't want the judges to have the discretion. And so the judges have a great history of putting public safety first. So I would say someone that's poor versus someone who has a lot of money, I mean, the bail for each one of those persons should be very different.
Oh, of course,
because,
yeah.
Like, I can afford a lot more to pay, so I would be required to pay a lot more. But also, we have to take into consideration criminal history. So if I'm a first-time offender and I have financial resources, my bail should be very low if I'm just not simply released, because it's a first time. Especially, that's also true with people who don't have money. If it's a first time to be arrested, your bail is going to be either no bail, or it's going to be you're just going to be simply released, or it's going to be very low. And a bond that's $500, I think anybody can post a $500 bond because you're paying less than $100 to the bonding company.
Yeah.
Or you're going to pay make payments, so it's going to be a nominal amount. So I think that when we just say, oh, it takes advantage of the poor and people that have money, that's the whole point of bail. It's supposed to be individual, and that's our concept of criminal justice. So when you're arrested the first time, we want to give you only the minimum amount of pressure to make you turn and become a productive citizen. You get arrested again, well, what we did the first time didn't work, so we're going to put more pressure on you the second. And as we go along, well, the pretrial release system's the same way. You get arrested, you're not going to be held. You get arrested second time, third time, fourth time, your friends start falling away from helping you, and your friends, your family sticks with you the longest, but even they will eventually fall away from you if you keep getting arrested and your crimes get more severe. That's why we call those people career criminals. They should not be released from jail. They should be held in jail. That's why if we want public safety, we have to hold the dangerous people in jail.
Yeah, and I think that's my point on the like rich person part, is that if someone's really rich and they can pay that, maybe they're as much of a danger as someone that's poor. And I realize it's going to be a different amount, but like, how do we keep? And I guess there's a question about that too, is because this is just on my understanding of it all. When it's, and maybe this is a state to state thing too, so maybe it's different. But when my understanding is that if you pay, like, if it's a private bond company, you're paying like 10% of the bond normally, right? Is that how it goes?
That's a good rule of thumb.
Rule of thumb. And then is that money, that money's gone though forever, right? Like you don't get
Well,
that
it's a
back.
premium.
Yeah.
You don't get your premium back from your car insurance.
Yeah.
Under any circumstances. It's
Yeah.
premium. And so you're paying premium for them to ensure that you will go to court. If you don't insure, just like if your car insurance, if you have a car accident, your insurance pays for your car accident. And for bail, your insurance company, your bondsman, ensures that you will appear for court. And if you don't, then they're going to pay for that, or they're going to pay for somebody to go find you to try to mitigate that to a lesser amount. But so, those are very similar situations. You're not going to get your premium back.
But the court doesn't get any of that money on private bond stuff, right?
But the court should not get that money.
And that's fine. That's what I'm saying.
Incentive for the courts. What the courts need to do is overlay on top of all of that a strong sense of accountability.
Yeah.
So if you don't show up for court, you don't automatically get released again. Your bail increases, or you got to have a little strong talking to. But you sure as hell don't get out 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, 10 times.
Yeah.
Miss court 10 times, and there's no accountability.
Well, especially
what we're missing right now is this accountability system.
Right. And that's like, to me, I'm always looking to not let someone's incentive be funding, because I don't like that. And really that's where going to the cash bond stuff, they are relying on that for funding of those court system stuff. So it's another reason I kind of go, well, I don't love that either, just because I always see anytime there's an incentive for especially a government agency to get extra funding via some external method. I don't love it, just because to me, that's our biggest problem with like civil asset forfeiture with police forces right now is they have incentive to steal stuff from people. And so but that goes back to on private bond stuff, they're not getting any of that money. So their only incentive is they're making a judgment call on, is this person a flight risk and or a danger to other people, and if this is the amount that we say was going to keep them here and show up for their trial, and we don't think they're a risk to someone else. And I also think that's a pretty easy judgment call too. If someone is constantly aggressively punching random strangers, that's different than if they murdered their wife. I realize murder is a more
one of the
heinous
problems
crime.
in New York is, even with all these rollbacks, the courts still are not able to consider dangerousness of the defendant in bail.
Which seems insane.
It just seems insane. That's exactly right. It just is absolutely insane. We should be able to consider someone's dangerousness on setting bail. And also, I think one of the things that gets lost on this rich-poor dichotomy is probably the number one benefit that the private industry has is by getting family members involved. And by getting families, look, if you're arrested 5 times and your family is still willing to stand up with you and say, I think you're still a good guy. I still think you have value. I still think you can be turned around. I mean, that has an impact on you when you've been arrested 5 times. And then if you decide to run again and there's going to be consequences on the family because they stood up for you, then there's a lot of pressure for you to come back. Yeah. And so I think that we're putting so much stress on, hey, look at the system is taking advantage of poor or taking advantage of by rich. Look, the family involvement is the key to turning people who would otherwise be career criminals, turning them back and turning them around and becoming productive citizens. One of my biggest criticisms of all this is, our government has already failed our inner cities. We've already failed the schools. We failed families. We've got tremendous dropout rates. We've got families that are failed. Drugs problem in our inner cities is just outrageous. No jobs in our inner cities. Look at all the, we could say protests, we could say riots from years ago, and they burned down substantial portions of our inner cities, and they didn't rebuild. So it made it even worse. Yeah. Tax base is now smaller in our inner cities. And so, but our government is saying, we're going to fix all this with criminal justice reform and bail reform. And it's not. This is a lot of people, this is their last chance to change their course, to change their trajectory. And the government's involvement is making it worse for them.
What do you think is a good solution for, obviously there are, but I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, what's the right way to hold judges accountable to do their job? Because to me, it seems like it's all coming back to judges should make judgment calls on criminal history if they're allowed to. But I mean, obviously they have to be allowed to look at, is this person a danger? But you're saying they're not even allowed to look at if the person is a danger in some states. So is this just a state by state thing that becomes, because I don't know, is there a federal solution to this? Because it seems like there might not be. This might be just a state by state. Everyone has to kind of work it out, right?
Bail, I mean, most crime regulation, prosecution of crimes is on the state level, but
Right.
we do have federal crimes as well.
Yeah.
So every state has their own system of release for criminals that are arrested on state charges, but the federal system has its own system of bail as well for the federal charges. Now, that system was reformed when Reagan was in office, and at that time that Reagan was in office, we were detaining about 25% of the people who were arrested and detained pre-trial until their case was over. And as a result of the reforms, it was intended to release more people. But now, all these years later, the federal system is a simple release or detain system, and we now detain approximately 75% of the people who are arrested pre-trial, and they're detained until their case is resolved. So if you were saying the federal system is the gold standard, nobody could afford that.
Right.
There's no state that can detain 75% of the people arrested, and it's not going to happen. And so the ones that attempt it end up getting to like California, where we have this 80% failure to appear rate on misdemeanors, and you're wondering, why do we even have prosecute misdemeanors anymore? So what we have to look to is, like, Texas enacted bail reform, but it was the opposite of what we're seeing in some states where they're strengthening it. They required the review of criminal histories in setting bail. They limited the use of simple release mechanisms for violent offenses. And we're going to see more of that. I mean, even, Texas was the first state to put some type of restriction on charitable bail funds, which, had no money before
2020, yeah.
2020, and then suddenly had millions and millions of dollars. But the problem is, they found out what the private industry has been saying for years. There's no low-level people stuck in jail. And so they started bailing out really dangerous people and having bad consequences. And then, the last thing I would say, and I would go back probably to something earlier, I just fill out that point, is, if you have a criminal history and they set bail an amount that you can't afford, it's not because you can't afford it. It's because you have a criminal history.
Right.
And that's not, that's okay under the current system for setting bail. I mean, we've heard from our friends on the other side, well, we've got to change the way we do bail because it's going to be held unconstitutional. No, we've had 2 federal courts hold it constitutional, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied cert on them. So bail is constitutional.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And now they're just saying, oh, it's not fair.
Yeah,
what do you mean it's not fair? I mean, we're hurting the very communities you're claiming that we're making it worse for them on the pretext that you're trying to help them.
Yeah, my opinion on almost all of this is that most Americans, from what I can tell, are very forgiving of people making mistakes. It seems like you see it all the time, of course, more with celebrities and that kind of thing, where someone has, they do something and we're pretty quick to forgive when someone is remorseful about that. And I think most people in the country do want people to be not like punished for their crimes, but they want to make sure that they're not a danger to people. I mean, that just seems like the overall, it's not so much, it's like, we think you should be in jail because you've proven that you're a danger. So it's not only about like paying for the crime you committed, but it's also about, we think you might commit that crime again, so you're a danger to society. But for people that aren't a danger, I feel like there's quite a bit of, there's certainly a movement of people that are going like, yeah, maybe we don't need someone that got caught with marijuana to be in jail for 40 years. It doesn't seem like that's actually doing more good than harm. And we can pick whatever those things are.
Let me just address that. I just did a podcast, and I haven't even released it yet because I'm behind, but I just did a podcast on this issue of marijuana. And, California has essentially legalized marijuana.
Right.
They're going to raise incredible amounts of money through taxes.
Although not near as much as they always promise, but yeah.
Well, but the problem is the legal marijuana infrastructure has collapsed in California, and it's been taken over by the cartels.
Right.
And they're not just manufacturing marijuana in Mexico or other countries. They're moving their whole operations into the United States, where we've decriminalized marijuana. and they're taking over federal lands and just setting up shop on growing, do all the stuff they need to do there. They're bringing in their workers
Yeah.
because of our open immigration policy. What are you going to do to them if you arrest them? So we're taking the tax dollars that are getting smaller every year for legal marijuana, and we're spending it on finding the illegal operations
Right.
and trying to destroy them, which we can't even keep up.
Right.
So we're on.
Oh, we know. Yeah, in
we're
Oklahoma,
on a-
we've got plenty of it. It's like Chinese nationals, actually. In
Yes, well, it
in
depends on what
Oklahoma
part of the
specifically.
country.
Yeah.
You got Chinese, you got Russians, you got.
Yep.
I mean, probably a year ago, if you just said this to me, I would have said, "That's just kind of conspiracy."
It does sound like it. I mean, we literally had some guys get like assassinated, execution style on their knees at a farm in Oklahoma, and they were Chinese nationals, and we didn't know that. Like, we had no record of them being in the country. I'm pretty sure. So it's very clear that yours. It's like, right, there's criminal activity, but to me, that's different than, like I said, the person that gets caught like before the legalization of this kind of stuff. And so I'm fine with it. Like, let's have those conversations, but that's also where we decide like what's a misdemeanor, what's a felony, what's a violent crime, what's a danger to someone else, what's not a danger. I think all those discussions are good to have, but the problem that I see is that people get arrested for something, they get released or get a slap on the wrist. I've got a buddy that's a cop that's, he arrested a girl at the mall, shoplifting. He was following her around. She kept stealing stuff. He arrested her. He's like, and in the search, she's got like $900 in her pocket. And he's like, what the hell are you doing? You've got $900 in your pocket. And she's like, well, if I steal less than $1,000, I know you're going to let me walk out of here with a $100 fine or whatever. And so it's worth it. That's the whole risk. People are not dumb. They know what the risks are. And to me, it's got such a bad tail on it when criminals are smart and they know what they can get away with. And then in places like DC and New York and stuff, you look at the laws that I think everyone agrees they should enforce, like gun laws. Like if you're in DC and you are arrested during a crime and you've got a gun that's stolen on you, to me, I think that's a pretty reasonable thing that everyone would go, that should be a crime that we take seriously. That person committed a crime, maybe a violent crime, had a gun on them that was stolen. But they're not. They're just not putting them in jail for that kind of stuff, which means they go back out and they do the same thing. And so I think in DC, the stat is something like, by the time someone's arrested for a homicide, they've been arrested for like 7 other gun charges or something. To me, that's the part of this that just makes no sense to me, that we go, okay, we're saying, because I don't really care what your income is. I don't really care what the color of your skin is. If you've been arrested multiple times with stolen weapons, and then that escalates to someone dying because of that, to me, that's the state that messed up at that point. Is that like the state should have taken care, that person should not be out on the streets anymore, and we allowed them to. Where's the accountability going to come from that? Is that just going to be eventually that people go, because like if this spreads, you can move out of California right now, which is why I think a lot of people are. You can move out of Illinois. You can even just move out of the urban areas to the suburban areas where they treat the law differently. But at some point, if that spreads enough, you can't just have every urban center of America be these crime-ridden places where we don't take that seriously. It seems like there's going to have to be some sort of catalyst that changes people's minds. Do you have any idea what that would be? Because it doesn't seem like the rising crime rates really took care of it, that we've seen over the last few years.
So, I mean, the problem that we have is we've tried in Portland this whole decriminalization of heavy drugs. So that was going to fix everything.
Did not work.
Didn't. And now those laws have lapsed, and we're going back to a system of, what I've said all along, accountability. The best hammer to get somebody to drug rehab is the threat of going to prison.
Yeah.
And if they don't want to go to rehab, then they're going to go to prison. And, you want the hammer because rehab has a 75% failure rate. So it only works 25% of the time. So you got to have that hammer over and over on them. I mean, and I'm speaking there from a family that had drug issues for 30 years. I mean, I had a sister who had a car accident and broke every bone in her face. And that started a 30-something year drug addiction to prescription drugs.
Oh, yeah.
And at the end of her life, I finally had her declared incompetent, and she was living in assisted living. And they were managing her anti-seizure medications and all these other, and I wouldn't agree to let her have any, really heavy painkillers,
Right.
and I just wouldn't approve it. And she probably had her best 4 or 5 years at the end, because someone else was regulating her medications, and she had no choice. But
Yeah.
I'm telling you, unless you have this some sense of accountability, and I agree, we need to review our criminal laws and we make a decision on what we enforce or what we don't. But until we change that mentality about crime, and drugs is a good example. I read a book one time that said, if we give up on drug crime, we're giving up on pretty much 80% of all crime, because it tracks and gets traced back to some way, form, or fashion to drugs. And so we can't just say, oh, we'll give up on drug crime and that's going to solve this problem. That's giving up on public safety. And the reason why I have hope is society demands public safety.
Yeah.
I don't really particularly admire Mayor Adams, especially with all he's got going on, but he would say that, one of the foundations of society is public safety. And if you can't provide public safety, then you don't have a society.
Yeah.
Our public will demand it. If the government will not give it to them, they'll give it to themselves. Where I see we are right now on crime, it just has a political tint to it on who gets prosecuted. You could make an argument that we're only prosecuting really our political opponents right now. And that perception needs to stop. And it's not going to. Right now, anytime one party loses a national election, it was stolen from them in some form or fashion. It's been that way for the last 4 elections. No one even cared when Hillary Clinton says it, but when Trump says it, it's treason. He should.
Well, Trump took it to a different level than Hillary Clinton did. I'll at least give her that. But I agree, it's the same thing.
Look, we don't get it. We don't hear about it. When Trump went into office the first time, we had cars being burned in D.C. We had all kinds of things. We had people don't certify the election, and nobody got thrown in jail.
Yeah, but it wasn't the president of the United States trying to steal the election. So it's a little bit different to me. But I agree. I think all of it is bad, because I think all of it sows distrust. Like, what I don't like about any of it is that these politicians and people and anyone else that's like on their little soapbox, they're using these institutions as sort of stepping stones for their own fame. And they're not really, they're willing to burn them down. So it's like, I don't like all the stuff of, calling the Supreme Court illegitimate just because you don't like the decisions they've made, or calling the whole criminal justice system corrupt or racist or something. I think all of these things are really bad, because they are trying to tear down the institutions that we need to have things like public safety and to have criminal justice and any of those kind of things. Or just, faith in that the election will be fair. That's the problem, is that there's been enough seeds sown on both sides now that what will happen no matter what. Like, whoever loses will claim that it was stolen, or that there was some nefarious thing, or it's like Hillary Clinton couldn't just admit that she didn't go campaign in Wisconsin and should have. It's like she has to say, oh, Russia helped Trump win the election, and that's ridiculous. But it's kind of the same thing with the criminal justice.
We used to have a time after election where everybody rallied around the president, or when there was an international conflict, they'd rally around the president. We don't have that anymore.
No.
I saw a debate, and maybe it was in the Reagan movie. There was a little debate with Reagan and his the guy running against him when he ran for re-election, and they were so civil to each other.
Yeah.
They were so cordial. They talked very friendly to each other. The only thing that I have to compare it to is the vice presidential debate we just had between Walton and what's his name?
J.D. Vance. Yeah. Everyone said the same thing.
They were very cordial to each other. And everybody was shocked. That's the norm in our history.
Yeah.
And usually when we have a big court ruling come out, the president would say, we put our faith in the system. We don't have that anymore.
Right.
If you don't like the ruling, it's illegitimate. If you don't like the election results, it's illegitimate. And I would argue that this started on one side, because every Republican that's run since probably Eisenhower has been Hitler.
Oh,
and
right.
The problem is, then we had the other side. The reason why people like Trump is he hits back just as hard. And people that, Bush too, would just sit there and take it and say, I'll let history judge whether I was a good president or not. And that just frustrated his supporters. Get down there and prove to them. And so I think that's part of the appeal of Trump and the reason why he was originally elected. I don't know
I
if
think you're
that's
right.
been kind of worn off now. I mean, who knows? But I will say this: I've never seen it as bad as it is right now, where the demagoguery that we have
Oh
from one
yeah.
party to the other. That he, I mean, when a party says that the other candidate is a danger to democracy, they will ruin democracy, they will end it. I mean, and my response is always, are they going to? Is he a danger to democracy, or is he a danger to the Democrat Party because you might lose? And if the answer is Democrat Party, well, then he's not a danger to democracy. But I mean, that's kind of language that in our history the public would punish if you used,
Yeah,
and we're
we don't
now in a
anymore.
period where they don't get punished for that.
Right.
But the system will be righted. I mean, the public will demand public safety, and so we've got a lot of things that the pendulum is going to swing in the opposite direction, and will fix, including criminal justice reform and these bad bail reforms, because you've seen them start being rolled back across the country, and it's just going to be worse. I mean, it's going to happen more and more, but we still have them reaching out. I mean, we've got a DA running in Harris County in Houston, third largest county in the country, being supported by these groups. And I would say he has the inside track for winning, even though they're probably going to lose 5 to 10 DA races. Gascon in LA is probably the biggest one. He only pulled 25% in the primary, and he made it to the end, but all expectations are that he will lose, and that Prop 47 will be rolled back as well.
How do you think we solve that on the DA level? Because it does seem like those are the stories that bubble up, obviously, because it's easy to focus on a DA in a city.
There's been some rollback. I mean, not rollback, but there's been some removal petitions filed, and they've been successful. There was a DA in Florida that was removed by the governor because they have the ability. They've given the governor that ability. Texas just enacted a statute authorizing the attorney general to file a petition for removal if a DA refuses to follow the law. You're going to see more of that. And Gascon would have been removed, but when they reviewed signatures, they disqualified a huge number of signatures. So, I mean, the perception was that the review of the signature process was very political, because then after that they raised the signature requirements for another one. And so he would have already been removed from office, I think, if that had not been politicized. I would just say that the politics is righting itself, because people can't get reelected on these results that we're seeing, and they can't defend it. They can have all these groups that throw them money. They can have all these groups that do research to give to them. They can have all these groups that give them press releases. If their platform is more crime, the public will reject it.
Yeah, but of course their platform's never going to say that. It will potentially result in that, but I think the problem is that people aren't paying enough attention to what's actually happening. They're just listening to the promises, whether they follow through on those or whether they
but I think, I told you, I just wrote an article. It was published yesterday or today. I can't remember. I don't know if I even know. But that's my conclusion is, if one side's saying crime's not increasing, you can't believe your lying eyes, and the other side is saying it is, they're going to reject everything and just look out in their own backyard and say, what do I see?
Yeah.
And if they see stores closing because they can't withstand shoplifting at record numbers, they see it's not safe to go anywhere in their community. If they see commercial properties dropping in value, half to a tenth of their original value, they're going to vote that crime's going up, and they're going to vote with their own eyes.
Yeah, I think the problem is that you can do a lot of damage in the 4 years or whatever term, different terms for people. You know what I mean? In the meantime, and so I think a lot of people are going. It's a weird situation with criminal justice specifically, because I think that most of the people that are voting for things have seen, some of the things that are wrong with it. Because it's to pretend that the criminal justice system is perfect would be silly, obviously. And so, but I think some people are just swinging that pendulum we talked about way too far to the other side to say, well, let's just try this crazy thing and not see if anyone's tried it before, not see if there's any evidence it'll work at all, not think about the trade-offs. And, you get into a situation where, Oregon's going to probably be dealing with this decriminalization of all drugs, even though it was only for like a couple of years, for a long time. Like the ripples
Yeah,
will
but they
be
were
felt on
setting
that.
record numbers of overdoses
Yeah.
every month while it was in effect. I mean, I
Yeah.
would argue that we've lost a generation
Oh, yeah.
because of very poor policy, for bad decisions, that utopian almost
Yeah.
in nature. Like you said, no data showing it would work, nothing. And you know what? They wouldn't even admit now that it didn't work. And because you started to see people arguing, well, you should have a right to overdose if you want. No, society cannot stand for that
Yeah,
proposition.
I think that would be an interesting argument to say that. Yeah, obviously
Well,
you're right. A lot of people died, and that's the direct result of what they thought would be better for people. But obviously, people dying of drug overdoses is not. We should not be like, that's a good outcome.
Well, one of the reasons why I think this pendulum has stuck longer on the left than it should have or would have is this whole concept of identity politics, where, because of your identity, you cannot vote for the other side. And I think that has worked. And, the issue that's worked for them is abortion. And so you've got, even 2 years ago, you had crime increasing and they were saying, no, it wasn't. But the abortion issue was enough to make up the difference.
Yeah.
So without the abortion issue, I think the pendulum would have already swung 2 years ago.
We shall see. Well, I appreciate coming on the show, Ken. Shoot me any links that you want, and I'll put them in the show notes. I do appreciate you coming on, and maybe we'll talk to you again sometime.
My thanks again to Ken Good for coming on the show. Please check out his podcast and blog. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you could do one thing for me, please rate this show wherever you listen. If you can do two things for me, share an episode or short content that I create on YouTube or Instagram if you think you know someone that might find it interesting. It really does help me grow this show because the algorithms prefer to reward outrage and fear, and I don't want to create that kind of content for you because there's already plenty of that. So thanks again for spending some of your valuable time with me. I will catch you next time.